As some other introductions for this program, I want to introduce you to the Dunn Museum and encourage you to come visit. For those of you who are not aware, the museum is located in Libertyville and features permanent exhibits from Lake County history all the way from prehistoric times to present day. This evening's program is sponsored by USG, making this a free program for all. USG also sponsors programs throughout the whole entire year, not just the History Symposium. They also offer free admission to the Dunn Museum every Thursday night from 5 o'clock to 8 o'clock p.m. So there's a great opportunity to come to the Dunn Museum for free. So to officially start our program, I would like to thank the Lake County Historical Alliance for their help in coordinating the symposium and the work they do year-round to emphasize the importance of local history. We are really lucky here in this area to have so many museums and historical societies that focus on building community and conducting active research. This is especially critical this year as we commemorate the 250th anniversary of signing of the Declaration of Independence, which allows us in this moment to take a closer look at the lesser known stories that helped shape our communities today. Okay, so that with our introduction being done, Nicole will put in our chat a program guide. I did also email this for you, but if you want to use this program guide throughout the presentation, you can help follow along with the presentations. It also has links to each of the organizations of the presenters tonight and will help provide more details on the Historical Alliance I just mentioned. So we hope this will be a helpful tool for this upcoming year as we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence and provide you with opportunities to visit new historical sites and museums. Okay, so I'm going to ask Dr. Patricia Mooney-Melvin to come on and start our first part with the keynote address. Dr. Patricia Mooney-Melvin is an Associate Professor of History and Public History Program Director at Loyola University Chicago. She has numerous scholarly articles and presentations on urban history and various aspects of public history, including heritage, tourism, interpretation, and public history pedagogy. She is a past president of the National Council on Public History and a founding member of the AASLH Women's History Affinity Group. She works with the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center on issues of visitor engagement. Her current research looks at memorialization on the urban landscape. So thank you for Dr. Patricia Mooney-Melvin for being here tonight, and I will turn it over to you to start your presentation.
Well, welcome everybody, and thank you. I want to thank the Dunn Museum and the County Historical Alliance and all the different groups who put this together, as well as all of you who are here tonight. So my task is really to talk a little bit about local history and why the elements of it and why it's important. And I think a major point with local history is, of course, that like politics, all history is local. No matter where it happens, it touches us wherever we are. So if we were to look at some of the elements of local history, kind of the big picture is that we look at the small in consultation with the large. There's always this kind of toggling back and forth. We look at the analysis of the changing consequences of place, of locality for people in a particular space and for society at large. And we'll see some of this over the course of the presentation. What we know about localities and what comprises them changes over time because we ask new questions. And as this conference suggests, we uncover new information, and that gives us a deeper appreciation for what we know and how we understand where we are. As we toggle between the large and the small community, local history makes the past tangible. It makes something that might happen in France, but impacts us, real because we see it around us, for example. And it touches us in a myriad of ways and sometimes in unexpected places. I'm going to start with this quote from something not from Lake County, but from Michael Palin, one of the Monty Python fame. He discovered his great uncle Harry, family records, and then he got intrigued and he started working on who was his great uncle. relied on local historians in Britain, as well as government documents and so forth. And one of the things that he says at the end of his exploration of his great uncle Harry's life is, one thing I have learned in this whole detective process is that the past is never as locked as it seems. There is always information hidden away somewhere, and none of it is insignificant. If we take that to local history, we can add then to what he says by saying all local history is, and then to quote him again, part of a constantly evolving process of finding out more about how we live and how we die. And I think in some ways that captures some of the essence of local history for many of us. But there are a variety of elements that characterize local history, and people intersect with local history in lots of different ways. One way is through personal connections to family and ancestors. We have some people looking at the Tyke Family Reading Room in the Dunn Museum. I have no idea what they're looking at, but it's the process of looking at documents to find out about your community, about your family. Certainly the popularity of Ancestry and Family Search have, generated lots of interest in people's desire to find out where they fit in their ancestral structure. We use local history to build identity. It connects people across time. It provides a sense of place and generates a feeling of belonging. Local historical organizations are important platforms to engage residents in discussions about who they are and about the community they inhabit. This is a scene from the Waukegan History Museum at the Carnegie. And one of the things is they opened their new site that they said, with the construction now complete, the Waukegan History Museum at the Carnegie is a world-class history museum in a landmark downtown building overlooking the lakefront. This vibrant, welcoming learning center will connect and tell the stories of our diverse community as it promises to help revitalize our city. And we'll see that theme in some of the other elements of local history. Zoom, all right.
All right, we have it up, and Nicole's gonna go to the Carnegie slide.
All right. Sorry about that. It certainly makes more sense when you can see the whole thing. All right, let's go back. Okay.
There we go.
All right.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for sticking with us.
Sorry about that. Oh, wait. Now I've lost. All right. So this particular slide, or what it says about the Carnegie. Nicole, can we move it up a bit? Or remove us at the top so that the whole slide can be seen? All right. Okay, I think we're fine. All right, so this last line about the vibrant, welcoming learning center will connect and tell the stories of our diverse community as it promises to help revitalize our city is a theme that we'll find throughout local history. Fostering community is another important element. It identifies bonds between people. It celebrates or reaffirms shared traditions or experiences. It serves as a bedrock for commemorative activities, and it provides local stories that connect people to one another. This particular slide is an example really of how commemoration of the 4th of July shootings, a certainly unfortunate event, allows for reclaiming space, which is the opportunity then to take back a community as part of the process of identifying and fostering our sense of place. It's also where we can understand large events through more personal ones in a local context. It illuminates how events, wherever they occur, impact everyday lives. It makes history, no matter how distant, seem less remote. It reveals the dynamics of local participation in state, national, or global events. So I have two examples, one which is of the Ivanhoe Congregational Church. This is a church that, like many churches, I'm sure, across the state, took up the anti-slavery cause during the years leading up to the Civil War. Like other congregations around the state, it rallied volunteers and church members to serve in the Union Army to free the enslaved and preserve the Union. So the participation in something which obviously touched the state, but also meant something larger to the nation. But we also, in our county and in local history at large, interact with global events. And so Fort Sheridan was an important training center during World War I. It was a model for some of the types of training that went on in other places across the country. What they did was alter the terrain. They built trenches. There was a mock YMCA hunt. What we can see here on the right, or my right anyway, the trench building to have a sense of moving across the battlefield, and then bayonet practicing on the other side. So just because something happened on the Western and Eastern Front in Europe, of course, it had an impact both in terms of people who served, but how the county or how a local place became part of the larger process. Another important function of local history is its ability to uncover hidden or overlooked stories. So I have a couple of examples, one from the History Center at Lake Forest and Lake Bluff. Had a grant to explore the African American experience in Lake Forest, documenting African American life in the community from the late 1880s. It's a project that had an exhibition and a variety of public programs that increased the awareness of this little known story. This is just a picture that captures an integrated moment in Lake Forest, but was a very rich story that they were able to tell. My second example comes from Brian Escobar, who's with the Waukegan Park District. A woman had contacted him about some items left by her father. He went to look at them. The contact led to an oral history. And as it turned out, the family used to run a local restaurant, the 400 Cafe. You can see some of the items here. And that the Perez family was one of the first Mexican families to settle in Waukegan, information which pushed back the date of settlement, the timing of Mexican settlement in the Waukegan community. Another way that we use local history is to inform present day decisions. One of my doctoral students, who I think was in school with Nicole, wrote her dissertation looking at local history and community action. And so her dissertation, Mobilizing the Past, Local History and Community Action in Metropolitan Chicago, 1960 to 1980, looked at the role that a small number of historical societies played and continue in some cases to play in engaging political decision-making processes. And usually the focus is on maintaining local character. They push developers, city leaders to take history into account when they're thinking about changes to the physical landscape or to justify the restoration of historic buildings. We also found, of course, that local organizations can serve as platforms to engage communities in conversations about civic responsibilities, such as voting, elections, and civic disenfranchisement. So one of the organizations that she studied was the Lake Forest, Lake Bluff Historical Society. It was organized in 1972 in response to population growth, new residential developments, and aging historic buildings and landscapes. And this process essentially allowed them to work on defining a sense of local character that continues to be used to evaluate plans for new development, respond to proposed changes to the physical landscape, and justify restoring historic buildings. So the local history that we do is not just to share information, but it has an impact on the ways in which we live in the present. And then we can find history in unexpected places. In some ways, finding local history where you don't expect it is like a bonus. And for me, one of those places is Lyons Woods Forest Preserve in Waukegan. More forest preserves should have more history in them, I think, but this one has a nice introduction to, the family and how the land was used, but then it has a section on the Curtiss JN4 Jenny airplanes, which brought a whole new dimension to, at least for me, my understanding of what happened in Waukegan. These types of things that intrude into our daily life reaffirm the importance of place and space. So this last slide, of course, has nothing to do with Lake County history, but it's a good cautionary tale. If you're a Simpson fan, you may have seen an episode from season 7, which was Lisa the Iconoclast. And what she did was participate in the bicentennial of her town, Springfield. She entered a contest to tell the story of Jebediah Springfield and highlight his life. Well, he turned out to be, based on her research and some documents that she found, not to be the great guy that they thought he was. He turned out to be a pirate and a scoundrel. She was mocked for finding this new information. They threatened to stop the whole, all the celebratory events. And ultimately, she decides, it's not what I would have decided, but ultimately she decides to ignore the information from the past to create community. And I think that that's the biggest challenge, to not ignore the challenges of the past, because I think in the end, it creates a better community. But that was not her particular approach. But I think that always hovers over us during periods of celebration. So let's go to the last slide, Nicole. Because I think it's particularly important in our 250th anniversary year. Towns and cities, counties, states, there's been information I know that's come out for Illinois, have been developing programming that will offer all residents opportunities to think about the interrelationship between past and present and what we, as county, state, or national citizens, want to see in our communities. And I think the challenge that we have is to confront our past, unsettling stories as well as affirming ones as we build towards our shared future. But local history has the central role, I think, in doing that. So thank you, and I'm sorry I messed up the slides at the beginning. And then this last one is just a thank you to the places and people that provided information.
Well, thank you for that enlightening presentation. I think this was really important in framing what we're going to be seeing for these next few presentations tonight and what will be coming next week on the night 2 of the presentation. And just framing and hearing those everyday moments that you experience with history, or those unexpected places that you find it, or those untold stories that might surprise you. It's what really the symposium's all about. And thank you again for framing this importance of local history and sharing these examples that are happening right now in our community of Lake County. And no worries about the presentation. What a wonderful way to start it off.
All right, thank you all.
All right. Our next presentation tonight, and we are going to bring up Jenny Berry, and her presentation is A Case of Mistaken Identity. Jenny Berry is the local history librarian at the Cook Memorial Public Library. She volunteers on the board of the Libertyville Historical Society and has served as president of the society for the past 10 years. She holds a BA in history from Augustana College, a Master of Library Science from Indiana University, and an MA in Public History from Loyola University Chicago, where she met Dr. Patricia Mooney-Melvin. And Jenny is also one that really helps us coordinate this program, this History Symposium every year, and provides excellent ideas. So thank you, Jenny, for being here tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
So hi, everybody, and thanks to Sarah. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jenny Berry, and I'm a member of the Libertyville Historical Society, and it's a pleasure to be part of this year's Lake County History Symposium. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the portrait that you see pictured here in the Ansel B Cook home and the historical surprise it presented us with. But before I get into that, I thought it might be useful to just have a little background on the Historical Society and the Ansel B Cook home to set the stage for this historical surprise. The Libertyville Historical Society operates the Ansel B Cook home in downtown Libertyville as a Victorian house and local history museum and archives. The Cook home started out its life as the summer or country home of Ansel B Cook, a successful Chicago masonry contractor. He started living there full-time after his retirement in the late 1880s. Cook passed away in 1898, and his third wife, Emily Barrows Cook, outlived him by about 20 years. When she died, the house and land was given to the village of Libertyville to become a library and a park. To make the home look more like a civic building, the porch roof was raised, columns added, and the exterior stuccoed. The home served as the library from 1921 until 1968, when the current library building was constructed. In 1954, local resident C.E. Carroll approached the Cook Memorial Library, then operating in the Cook home, about the creation of a historical room. This led to the creation of the society in 1955, and we just turned 70 years old this past year. When the current Cook Library building opened in 1968, the Historical Society began renovations of the home to transform it into a Victorian house museum. And it's been over 50 years since the first tours were given of the Cook home, and our all-volunteer organization is still going strong. We hold public open houses on Sundays in the summer from 2 to 4, and the first 2 weekends in December during Dickens of a Holiday, and group tours by appointment. But we do more than tours. A lot of our work is directed towards the care of our collections of Victoriana and local history. A dedicated group of volunteers works on organizing, arranging, and storing materials for long-term preservation. So that's a brief look at the Ansel B Cook home and the Historical Society. Now, I became a docent at the Ansel B Cook home and joined the board in 2012. And the 30-inch by 25-inch portrait, which is the subject of my talk this evening, was hung above the fireplace in the parlor since the Historical Society took over the home. While working as a docent, I noticed the portrait was badly cracked. The docent guide I was given said that the portrait above the fireplace was Ansel B Cook's picture as a young man. As a new board member, I suggested that since this was a portrait of the home's original owner, we should investigate getting it repaired. The board agreed, and we took the portrait to a Chicago conservation company for treatment. Now, of course, we were going to need to raise some funds in order to help cover the cost. So we put a blurb in our spring 2013 member newsletter, which at that time was only in print. And in response to the newsletter, we received an email, and it started, "Several years back, you sent me some materials about Ansel Cook, my great-great-grandfather, and his daughter, Ida. As you know, Ida married Albert Bliss Strong, a Chicago physician. I am researching the Strong/Cook family for a prospective biography of my grandfather, Walter Ansel Strong. You have been kind enough to include me on the mailing list of the Libertyville Monoline Historical Society newsletter, which I very much enjoy reading. In your spring 2013 issue, you have printed a picture of a picture which you wish to restore. You identify the subject as Ansel Cook in his younger days. However, when I saw it, I found it looked quite familiar, and I wonder if it's possible that it could be a likeness of Albert Strong instead. I have attached a photo of Dr. Albert Strong for you to compare against the one you are looking to repair. Sincerely, David Strong. Now, to say that the board was shocked was an understatement. So remember, this is our picture, and this is the picture that David sent. This is our picture on the left, and a portrait on the right that is identified, or we had identified, as Ansel Cook. So let me tell you, we did a lot of looking back and forth, closing one eye, closing the other, comparing noses, comparing ears. There was a lot of consternation. So while the photograph and the portrait aren't an exact one-for-one matches, the vest neckline is a little different, the face in the portrait is a bit narrower, it was hard to ignore that it might be the same man. And then really looking at the cracked portrait and what we thought was a portrait of Ansel B. Cook as an older man, seen here on the right, were there any similarities? Could the aging process have changed Cook enough? Loss of hair, broadening of face, for the young man and the old man to be the same person? Now, I'm sure facial recognition software or AI could help us today, but remember, this was 2013. We weren't that technology savvy. We didn't even think about flipping the portrait of Mr. Cook around so that he was facing the same direction as the new one. We're a little more technology savvy today, so just for kicks, I will do that and turn him around so that we can look at them all in the same direction. Now, to take it even a little further, I decided to see what would happen if I used AI, and I asked 2 different AI platforms to generate an image of Mr. Cook 20 years younger. And you can see you got 2 very different interpretations. So even with AI, we're just comparing the portraits and the photographs side by side visually. And so we really wanted to find out if we could figure out if there's any other information that would help determine if this was the same man or the portrait of 2 different men. And we started by going to the Society's records. Now, the records go back into the 1950s, but the record for the portrait in question, as well as 2 other portraits in our collection, was created in 1972, 3 to 4 years after the Society took over the former Cook Library. And there's no source or donor given, so there's no clear provenance, but the items are still in our collection, and the accession numbers are intact, so we know we have the right record at least. So what else could we do? We started out with double checking the identity of the portrait of Mr. Cook, but as an older man. The portrait was hanging in the Cook Memorial Library as early as this circa 1930 picture on the left. Today that room is the front parlor of our Victorian House Museum, but at the time it held the librarian's desk. So it's most likely that the portrait was handed over directly from the library to the Historical Society. And since it hung in the library, it's probably Ansel B. Cook, but was there anything else that we could do to prove it? Well, fortunately, Ansel Cook photographs exist in other collections, as well as other pictures in our own collection. We have this cabinet card on the left, which is identified as Ansel Cook, and that same cabinet card is in the collection of the Bess Bauer Dunn Museum of Lake County and the Chicago History Museum. In all cases, the cabinet card is dated as circa 1875 to 80, which puts Cook at about 52 to 57 years old. There's also images of Ansel in various publications, such as The Past and Present of Lake County, published in 1877, as well as the Portrait and Biographical Album of Lake County in 1891. The artist representations are a little bit different, but assuming the drawings were done about the same the time the books were published, these are images of Cook between 54 and 68 years of age, respectively. So we felt like we had a lot of evidence that the portrait in our foyer was in fact Ansel B. Cook, somewhere in the age range of 52 to 68. Unfortunately, we couldn't find any pictures of Cook as a young man. We even reached out to the Haddam, Connecticut Historical Society, which is where the Cook family came from, but they did not have any Cook family photos. So now we'll turn back to the other portrait in question. How did this one come to the Historical Society? Well, we have a circa 1890 photo of the portrait hanging prominently in the Cook home foyer, but we don't have a picture of it in the home when it was the library. The next photo of the portrait is from June 1969, when the portrait is already hanging in its current spot. So again, we're guessing, but we're thinking that it was left in the house when it was turned over to the village to become the library, and then the library passed it on to the society. But even that provenance or guess of provenance doesn't help with identification. If it's not Mr. Cook, it's at least someone of high regard to the family since it was hanging in their house in their foyer. A portrait of Dr. Albert Bliss Strong, who was Ansel's son-in-law, is not out of the question. And we know the Cook and Strong families were close. In fact, they share a gravesite in Chicago's Graceland Cemetery. Yet when the portrait was accessioned in 1972, the portrait was identified as being Ansel, so no one had taken the time to label the portrait. And we thought, well, wouldn't somebody in Libertyville have known Dr. Strong? When the society formed in 1955, there were still people alive who knew Mr. Cook. Sometime in the 1950s, a high school student wrote a paper about Ansel Cook, and he interviewed 83-year-old Jay Morse and 91-year-old Raupp Bulkley to gather memories of the man. And I thought, well, would they have known Dr. Strong? It's possible. We know Dr. Strong visited the town with his wife, Ida. They had a house they called Clover Cottage somewhere on the rear of Cook's Libertyville property. But the Strongs had a strange marriage, and Ida is found in the personal news visiting town more often than Albert, and they were divorced in 1896. So it's possible that Dr. Strong didn't make lasting connections in Libertyville. And in any case, by the time the portrait was cataloged, it was 70 years after Dr. Strong's death, and anyone who would have recognized him, including Mr. Morris and Mr. Bulkley, had passed as well. So we thought we'd follow the same research process we did with Mr. Cook, and we next tried to find other known images of Dr. Strong. Now, the photo sent by David Strong was among his grandfather Walter Strong's papers that have been passed down through the family in a strong chain of custody. The family's identification of the photo seems solid, but we wanted to make sure and see if we could find any other images. And we did find that the Chicago History Museum has a labeled cabinet card. It's not dated, but the photographer is Mosher, the same photographer that did the Cook cabinet card that we saw earlier. So based on the provenance of the first image and the existence of a second labeled image at a Chicago institution, we were confident that the photograph sent to us is Dr. Albert Bliss Strong. And these two photographs are very similar visually to the portrait. Again, but that's just visual. Was there any other documentation that we could find that would help us determine this was Dr. Strong and not a young Mr. Cook? So we thought about looking at the style of the portrait. This has been identified as a crayon portrait, and crayon portraits were popular beginning in the mid-19th century when the solar enlarger was introduced. Crayon portraits use a photograph as a reference, so the subject did not sit for a painter, for example, and they offered an affordable alternative to painted portraiture. And this technique remained popular until the turn of the 20th century. So here on the bottom picture, we have some modern day crayons. These are made from graphite and colored clay. And while they're not as waxy as the familiar Crayolas, they are waxier than pastels and charcoal. In its 1882 book, Crayon Portraiture, Complete Instructions for Making Crayon Portraits on Crayon Paper and on Platinum, Silver, and Bromide Enlargements, say that 2 times fast, J.A. Barthheit describes several processes for making crayon portraits. The artist might start with a projected negative and then go over the outline, or they could use a magic lantern projector to make an enlargement from a cabinet card or photograph. And there was also a tracing paper and transfer method. Unfortunately, knowing it's a crayon portrait doesn't really narrow it down for us since they were popular from the 1860s until the turn of the century. It's possible that a crayon portrait of Cook at about age 35 to 40 could exist, I don't know whether that age qualifies as a young man, so that's still a question. We thought, well, what if we looked at the clothing? What could that tell us about the possible date of the portrait? Unfortunately, since crayon portraits were made from a reference photograph, there is a possibility the portrait reflects the clothing of an original earlier image. And it can also work the other way around. Crayon artists could update the clothing for the final portrait. And men's fashion didn't change as frequently as women's. The length of a coat was often an indicator of a period, but we can only see the torso and up. The details of lapels and ties varied a bit over time, and so did hair and beard styles. And you can see some of these small changes in the pictures of US presidents on the right. Extra credit if you can name them all. To me, the closest match between our image and the president's is the 1876 or 1881 pictures. Our portrait doesn't look a lot like the 1850s or 1860s to me. Again, so far, we're still looking at visual clues. Now, luckily enough, looking closely at our portrait, we can see an artist's signature. The portrait is signed Bressan, B-R-E-S-S-A-N. And on closer examination, the Bressan signature is also on the portrait of the woman as identified as one of Cook's wives on that same accession record. And it's also the same signature on a portrait only identified in our records as portrait of a child. But a bonus, that portrait is also dated. So we thought, well, if we can determine when this Bressan, who he was and when he was in Chicago, we could probably get closer to the date the portrait was actually made. And since we have one that was dated, it made sense to start around that time period. So started with the 1880 census and looked at some city directories as well. And in the 1880 Chicago census, there's a Giovanni Bressan, age 32, an artist born in Italy with a wife and 18-month-old child. But I could not find him or variant spellings with an O-N or an E-N in the Chicago census for 1850, 1860, or 1870. In the city directories online, Bressan first appears in Chicago in 1880 and is last found in the 1887 directory. I wanted to figure out maybe where did he come from? Could we kind of confirm that he was where he was before he came to Chicago? His son that was in the census was born in Pennsylvania just a year and a half before the census was taken. So that seemed like a good place to look. And we found that Bressan worked in Philadelphia and Atlantic City in the 1870s. Several of his works were included in the 1877 Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts exhibition. He took commissions, but he also made crayon portraits of famous actresses. His portraits were displayed in Philadelphia shop windows, and he became known for his life-size crayon portrait of the actress Lottie Crabtree in her role in the play La Cigale. He also reproduced Fanny Davenport and Sarah Bernhardt. Now, I couldn't find any images of Bressan's work, but there are plenty of photographs available online of his subjects as seen here. Then in August 1879, Bressan left town quickly under a, quote, cloud. A constable's sale of his personal effects was held, and several court orders were issued to recover pictures he was alleged to have sold without authority. Bressan made his way to Chicago and set up shop again. The Chicago newspapers reported on his crayons of European actresses, like those whose photographs are seen here. They were on display in a State Street dry goods store window in November of 1881. Again, the images here are not his work, but he could have used these photographs to make his crayon enlargements. And I found that at that time, his studio was in the American Express building on Monroe between State and Dearborn. And coincidentally or not, the 1873 American Express building's masonry work was done by Ansel Cook's Masonry Company. Bressan's tenure in Chicago came to an end with his sudden death in 1887. He was well known enough that his death garnered a spot on the front page of both the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Inter-Ocean newspapers. So now we've determined that Giovanni Bressan was in Chicago from about 1880 to his death in 1887. That rules out that our portrait was done in the 1850s or 1860s when Mr. Cook would have been a young man. even if Bresson completed that portrait somewhere other than Chicago, he was born about 1847. He would have been a child prodigy if the portrait was done then. So Ansel Cook would have been between 57 and 64 years of age while Bresson was working in Chicago. And unless Cook commissioned a portrait of himself based on a much younger photographic reference, our cracked portrait cannot be Mr. Cook. So with this information, in addition to the photographs supplied by David Strong and found at the Chicago History Museum, we feel confident that the cracked portrait is an approximately 35-year-old Dr. Albert Bliss Strong. So now we've identified this as somebody other than who we thought it was. What is that? Will that have any impact on our other Bresson portraits? The woman in the front parlor is identified as Mrs. A.B. Cook, parentheses, third wife on our accession records, but then third wife is crossed out and someone wrote in first wife. The cabinet card on the left is positively identified as Cook's first wife, Helen Maria Foster Cook, circa 1875 to 80. And besides the fact that the two women don't look much like each other, Helen passed away in January 1881. If Bresson did her portrait, it would have been one of his earlier Chicago works, and unless it was based on a much earlier photographic reference, the woman in the Bresson portrait is too young to be Helen at that time. Ansel married Annie Barrows in February 1882. Could the portrait be her? I did find a newspaper article from August 1885 stating that Mr. Bresson has just completed a fine 3/4 length figure of Mrs. Cook of West Adams Street that is a striking likeness. At that time, the Cooks did live on Adams Street, so this is likely referencing our second Mrs. Cook, but we don't have a 3/4 portrait. Annie passed away in 1891, and within a year, Ansel married again, this time to Emily Barrows, Annie's sister. But 1891 is after Bresson's death, so this isn't a portrait of Emily. The two portraits are in the same type of frames, which might indicate they were done at the same time. So the thought was maybe this was Ida, the daughter of Ansel and Helen Cook, and Albert Strong's wife. We didn't have any photos in our collection of Ida to compare it to. So now all the research that I've just covered was done off and on over a period of about a year. And in the meantime, David Strong was continuing his family research. Now, after Ida and Albert divorced in 1896, Ida was granted custody of their youngest son, Richard. And after the death of her father, Ansel, in 1898, she and Richard moved to California, where she supported herself as a vocal and music instructor and raised Richard as a single mother. When I emailed David in June 2014 to tell him about my research on Bresson, he had just returned from a visit to Idaho, where he met Leslie and John Strong, sons of Ida's son, Richard. And although Ida's personal papers were lost when the storage locker containing them was vandalized sometime after her death in 1924, Leslie and John did have some family items, including this album containing images of Albert and Ida side by side. I literally gasped when I saw them, and actually just thinking about it now, again, it was quite a moment. So the image of Ida likely served as the reference for the portrait. So I'd like to introduce you to Ida Cook Strong. And the Strongs also had other photos of Ida at various ages, from a child to an older woman. In addition to correctly identifying the portrait subjects, this new knowledge also helped us correct the misidentification of Ida as a Cook wife in this family portrait. So I had to ask David, was there a photo of a baby? Not only does Leslie have a picture of the baby, but he is sitting in a chair with fringe, just like the portrait. You cannot believe the history happy dances I did because of these photographs. So this is Albert Cook Strong, the first son of Ida and Dr. Albert Strong. And while he is very much alive in the photograph, young Albert died just short of his first birthday in March 1881. The Bresson portrait was likely completed after the baby's death. Keeping with Victorian custom, a child, especially a boy, holding flowers in this manner indicates the child has passed. But wait, you're thinking, what about the known Ansel B Cook portrait? Was it also by Bresson? Why, yes, it was. And it has a second signature, Carling. Giovanni Bresson partnered with Henry Carling in July 1885, but by November of the same year, they had split. So that now puts a firm date of 1885 on the Cook portrait. Whereas Bresson's life came to an early end at the age of 40, Henry Carling was a more well-known artist. He was born in Manchester, England, and an obituary stated that he began his career as a boy who dodged policemen to draw crayon portraits, crayon pictures on sidewalks of England. So when I read that, I can't help thinking of Dick Van Dyke as Bert in Mary Poppins and his chalk drawings on the sidewalks. Carling moved to Philadelphia sometime before 1876. It's possible that Carling and Bresson crossed paths for the first time in that city, and then Carling spent some time in New York before landing in Chicago in 1882. But by 1888, Carling had left Chicago and settled in St. Paul, Minnesota, where he lived until his death in 1932. Several of his portraits are in the Minnesota Historical Society collection, as well as the Tweed Museum of Art in Duluth, Minnesota. So while we thought we were fixing Mr. Cook, it turns out it was his son-in-law, Dr. Albert Bliss Strong, all along. And the first or third wife of Ansel B. Cook turned out to be his daughter, Ida, and the unidentified baby is Ida and Albert's firstborn son. So as a result of all this, we can now tell a story about the Cook family, not just Mr. Cook, during our tours. And we've made a lasting connection with one of their descendants. And in fact, in 2021, David Strong did a Zoom presentation about his family for our History Matters lecture series. Despite his parents' divorce and his father's death in 1900, David's grandfather, Walter Ansel Strong, became publisher of the Chicago Daily News. And if you're interested in the family, you can check out that recording on the Libertyville Historical Society's YouTube channel. And I just want to conclude with a couple of takeaways I have from this experience. One is that what we know about history, especially local history, really seems to me to be based on the information available to the researcher at any given time. Often you're making educated guesses. The Historical Society members who first cataloged these portraits didn't have much information to go on. They made the identification based on the information or lack of information they had, and we have such greater access to information today. The second takeaway is it's okay to question the common knowledge. Trust but verify. These portraits were in the Cook home for nearly 50 years before we received David's email suggesting the cracked portrait wasn't Mr. Cook as a young man. So that's the story that was passed on to new docents and told to visitors year after year. It took someone thinking, to change what we know. And the last is that it never hurts to keep looking for additional information, especially with the amount of content that is continually being added online. You might just find something new. Preparing for this presentation, I did just that. I went back and did more research and found this. What I believe to be a mention of the very crayon portrait in our collection. It says, a fine crayon head of the wife of Dr. A.B. Strong is shown. The finish of this picture is fine, particularly the eyes. Well, we had guessed that the portraits of Ida and Albert were done around the time of their 1879 wedding, and it's likely that the photographs they're based on still were taken at that time. We now have a new piece of information which suggests the crayon portraits were completed in 1881, the same year as the dated portrait of their first son. So I'd like to invite you to come see these portraits at the Ansel B. Cook home in Libertyville. Our next public open houses will be in summer 2026 when we are open every Sunday, but we do group tours by appointment on the off season. Please visit our website, libertyvillehistory.org, to learn more. Thank you for your attention, and I believe Sarah's going to open it for questions.
Yeah, Jenny, this was such a fascinating story, so riveting. Something that I always talk about with kids is like, if you want to be a historian when you want to be up or grow up, maybe you want to be a detective, because being like a historian is also like being a detective, and that's what you were during this whole story was being a detective.
Oh, completely. Yeah, that's definitely it was all detective work, and that's what I like about history, actually. I love doing the detective work.
Yeah, and there are some great comments in here just emphasizing the importance of research and the amount of trusting but verification that you went through to make sure that you were proving and keep on going one step further. So some great examples of continuing your research and thinking beyond and asking those questions. What else? What else? What else? And that there's new information still being discovered. Like you said, just going back to doing this presentation, you were able to find another verification that's probably of that same portrait. Just also so fascinating. Um, and now I want to go see these in person. Um, these are so great. There's some people sharing other stories in the comments how they have similar portraits or similar photos that no one's been able to identify in their family, and they're like, where did these come from? But we do have a few questions, and I'll encourage other people to put their questions in the chat too. And if you have a question but don't want to chat, raise your hand and I can work to unmute you. Um, but I'll start off with just kind of a basic museum question that someone has asked. What is a cabinet card for, and are they still used?
Oh, that's a good question. I am not an expert on the different types of photographs. They are not still in use. On a cabinet, there was calling cards or like smaller, like carte de visite, like you would visit with someone. The cabinet card is a little larger, but I'm not personally on exactly what they were used for. There may be someone on the line that does know that though.
Someone has also asked who was important, wealthy, and prominent enough to have a portrait made. Did you have to be really wealthy, or was it a common thing to have your portrait being made?
I didn't see, or I wasn't paying attention when I was doing the research on how much it costs to have one of these done. What I did see when just looking at crayon portrait information in general was that it was a cheaper alternative because you didn't have to sit while someone actually painted you.
Mm-hmm.
So that would make me think that it was open to more people than having an oil painting done, for example. But I don't know an
Mm-hmm.
exact cost.
Yeah. And what is being done today to keep recording the history? How are you documenting all of this and what's being done today?
Well, this is we changed all of our docent guides. So there are probably docents I saw some names logging into have never heard the story that was anyone other than Dr. Albert Bliss-Strong. And I hope it actually encourages them to ask other questions. And that's how we can keep, finding out information. This is the first time that this has actually been kind of consolidated into a presentation or a write-up. And this will definitely get put with the accession information that we have about it. So in the future, after I'm not here, our other people who know this information will know all the research that was done to identify it.
Double checking. Yeah, it's important to document, like I said, keep it with accession records, make sure people know the story. I don't know, this could be a whole article for something, the amount of research and extensive forensic science that you were doing. You mentioned at the beginning how you did this all without AI, thinking how popular it is now, but I think that makes the story even better, shows how important it is to do real research and not rely on those AI forensic stuff that you could have done, like pairing the images and flipping them, makes for a better story.
Yeah, I can't believe I didn't flip it. I mean, I probably could have figured out how to do that. I was not particularly impressed with the AI options, but I was
Yeah.
using simple chat GPT and a copilot. I wasn't using a fancy service.
Right, yeah. Um, all right. I don't see any further questions, but Jenny will pop back on later on tonight. So if you have any other questions, feel free to ask her. And Jenny, we did put a link in the chat to Libertyville Historical Society, but maybe we'll do it one more time since there's been so many comments coming through too.
Super. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Jenny. All right. So we will bring on our final presentation of the evening. Tonight, the last presentation of the night is More Than a Murder Mystery with Marina, Mayne, and Debbie Fandrei. Marina, Mayne has been the museum registrar and public educator at the Raupp Museum in Buffalo Grove for the past 7 years. In her role, she manages the care of the museum's collection and archives, in addition to building exhibits and assisting with the museum programming. Marina loves uncovering mysteries in the historic record and making local history as accessible as possible. So she loves uncovering mysteries in the historic record and making local history as accessible as possible. She has a BA in anthropology from the University of Michigan and an MA in museology from the University of Washington. Debbie Fandrei, who is now back, thank you, Debbie, was born and raised in Grays Lake and went to school in Minnesota and Virginia, and then came back to work in Lake County museums. She's been the curator at the Raupp Museum in Buffalo Grove for over 25 years and still loves sharing local history with visitors, where she can watch their faces as they realize that happened here. Again, what's really important about this program tonight. All right, so I will turn over this murder mystery to you all. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for having us. We're excited to be here, talk about a really interesting story, local story. So Debbie and I both work at the Raupp Museum. We are Buffalo Grove's local history museum, right on the border of Lake and Cook County. And this evening, we are going to talk about a murder mystery that happened in 1899. Now, our story started here at the museum with George Widener. And George Widener and his wife, Clara, are shown on the left there, their wedding portrait. And George Widener was a prominent businessman in Buffalo Grove. He owned one of the Widener General Stores, shown on the right, which was off of Aptekissick Road in the northwest corner of Buffalo Grove. George and his brothers owned multiple stores in Buffalo Grove, and the Widener family was very prominent in the town. Now, George Widener also kept a diary, and in his diary, he wrote about upcoming weddings, when people were having children, all the events, including one in particular entry that we found fascinating from July 16th in 1899. Now we're going to another George. So there's two Georges. There's George Widener, and he wrote about George Kruger. In his entry, he wrote, George Kruger was shot by his wife today. She killed her mother and herself too. And upon reading this, museum staff were really interested. This is a very small community at the time, less than 150 people in Buffalo Grove area. Each little town, everyone knows everyone. On the right, there is a portrait that was published in the newspaper after the event happened of George Kruger and his wife. Now, not 5 days later, George Widener writes in his journal, George Kruger taken to Waukegan for murder trial for killing his wife and her mother. Now, this made us stop and go, well, what happened in those 5 days over 126 years ago, 127 years ago, that for this murder mystery? So we sought out to do research to figure out what happened. On July 17th, the Waukegan News Sun published an article titled Murder, Woman Shoots Her Own Mother and then Herself. They claim that it was caused by family troubles and that George was also a victim. Now, according to George's story, I want to give you some context about where we are in the late 1800s. On the right, the darker colored is Vernon Township. On the left is Ela Township. Buffalo Grove is circled in the bottom right-hand corner. That's where our store, George Widener's store, is located down that way. Long Grove is in the center. And in the top left is the farm of George Kruger and his wife, Bertha. Now, George tells the story as such to everyone he encounters that when it first happened. The story goes, George was out in the fields, in the strawberry fields, and he was picking strawberries, and he was coming back towards the house to greet his wife, Bertha, and to help his mother-in-law, Margaret Voss. And as he's approaching the house, Bertha comes storming out of the house and starts shooting at George. And he gets shot once in the arm, and then she shoots 3 more times, and he starts running away towards the neighbor's house. And so we are up here at the Christian Voss is the Kruger's farm. Just a few years after, it was owned by his mother-in-law and father-in-law originally. And so he runs south towards LaFran's farm, his neighbor. And he's shouting, as he reaches his neighbor's farm, he's shouting, "Bertha shot me, Bertha shot me." And his neighbor can see that he is in fact shot in the arm. And the neighbor says, "Well, we have to figure out what's happened." George does not want to go back. So the neighbors all around gather up and they head towards the house. In the home, they open the door and they find that both Bertha and her mother, Margaret, have been shot in the head and are on the ground with the gun in Bertha's hand. Now, George, according to George's story, he is shot, he runs away, he gets everybody there. So now at this point, everyone in the whole area is coming towards the house to see what's happened. All the neighbors are coming because this is a huge event. And they cannot get a hold of the coroner yet for many hours. So this happens in the afternoon. Then by 11:30, the coroner arrives at the farm. He does the work on the bodies in the barn by candlelight, 11:30 p.m. into the morning. And it seems like a closed and shut case. They are going to bury Bertha and Margaret, and that is the end. But people in the town start to talk. And there were a few quotes from the Waukegan News-Sun from July 17th about the relationship between George and Bertha. One saying they quarreled constantly, fought like cats and dogs. One person was talking about naturally Kruger as the father of the household would want to be master, but the women thought that they had the same privilege. In the process of all this talking, people also note the fighting that they had over who owned the farm. Now, Bertha's mother, Margaret, actually owned the farm, and it was going to be passed down to Bertha. And that was very upsetting for George Kruger because his family was a prominent family in the area. His father, William Kruger, had lots of land, and he wanted to have his own land too. So as people are talking, they're thinking, man, this investigation went really fast, and all of this gossip gets to the sheriff. And the sheriff starts looking at all the evidence, and he comes to the conclusion that Kruger is the one who killed Bertha and Margaret. Now, about a week later, after they have buried Bertha and Margaret, they exhume the bodies to examine them in more detail to get all the facts. They find that there were actually 2 bullets in both Margaret and Bertha's head, one of which for Bertha entered in the front and one actually from the back. So now the sheriff is thinking this is not probable for Bertha to do herself. She must have been shot by someone else. And the same according to George's story, as he's leaving the house, he hears 3 shots. Well, the revolver that they have in their house at the time only holds 5 bullets. So at some point, she would have had to fire and then reload and then fire 4 more bullets. This seems improbable to the sheriff. In addition, other evidence comes to light. For older revolvers, when you are shot up close, it leaves powder marks on your clothes versus far away. Well, George's clothing had marks on it, suggesting that he self-inflicted that gunshot wound and shot himself in an attempt to look like he was the victim of Bertha during that time. So George is subsequently arrested under this evidence. Now, George is then taken to the Waukegan Jail and Courthouse in 1899. And this is in July and August, July, August, September, October, when the trial is taking place. And here I've put up a portrait of what the Waukegan Jail and Courthouse looked like in 1909 to give you an idea. Now, this trial had now reached all areas of Lake County. It was a huge deal. And even when they were picking jurors, they had issues with people not wanting to be on the jury, or because everybody knew everybody, and some people didn't want to be involved. So it became a huge deal. Now, after deliberation on March 30th in 1900, George Kruger is given a life sentence. The jury decides, based on all the evidence that we just talked about, that after 7 hours, he is guilty and that he shot Bertha and his mother-in-law, Margaret. Now, it takes several months for the verdict to come. And because they try to have another trial to show his innocence, but the judge says no. And subsequently, George is sent to Joliet Penitentiary. And I have a picture here of the time period that when George would have been sent to Joliet in about 1900. And in addition, I've included some photos. There's of Joliet today. This is on the left is one of the more earlier solitary confinement cells. And George would have been sent to solitary confinement 1 day a month as a result of his sentence as well. And then the one on the right is the other cell where he would have stayed with another inmate, and at times 2 inmates, because Joliet had so overcrowding. So he would have been in the right for a majority of the other time. But the story does not end there. After 11 years, George is freed. His life sentence had been commuted to 20 years after a few years on good behavior. Following that, George's family and his father, William Kruger, who is very prominent in the area, start talking to the governor, start talking to others in the area, and they are saying George is not guilty. And George maintained his innocence throughout the whole trial. And he still maintained his innocence. And so they said you cannot say without a doubt that George shot Margaret and Bertha. And so he is paroled after 11 years. And in a twist at the end of all of this, after he is set free, the farm where he lived with his mother-in-law and wife is set for sale. And because if you remember, a point of contention with this family was that who owns the farm, and George was jealous that he couldn't have the farm and not as much money as his other family members, and that Bertha owned the farm technically. So they had after he was let out, they sold the farm, and they were trying to determine who died first. Did Bertha die first, or did Margaret die first? Because it mattered if George would inherit the estate. If Margaret died first, then the estate passes to Bertha, and then it passes to George by law. Now, if Bertha dies first, her portion of the estate goes back to Margaret, her mother, and then If Margaret then dies, it goes to the children. George and Bertha had 2 children. Well, based on the evidence, they determined that Margaret had died first, therefore all the dower passed to Bertha, who then passed to George. So George was freed and given the largest extent of the money from the sale of the farm. Now, George Kruger actually remarried shortly after he was let out, and he lived until 1945. Margaret and Bertha were buried together, and subsequently they are all 3 in the same cemetery. Now I'll turn it over to Debbie.
Okay, so while it's a good story, as part of being a museum, what we especially wanted to do is think about the different ways we could share this story. And in the beginning, it started out as an exhibit where we told the story of the crime and what happened. But after that, because once again, it's a story that sticks with you, we wanted to figure out if we could do something more. And at that time, we learned that Girl Scouts had a forensic science badge. And we already knew that this was a real window on both the history and science of the time. And while the Girl Scout badge was originally intended just to get them to talking about to police and about forensic science now, we realized that this could talk about not only the forensic science of the time, but also how things have changed. And so in conjunction with the story, we developed some things, and we did more research, a bit like Jenny doing the portrait research, and found out that in 1899, this was exactly when fingerprints were becoming acceptable police science, and that in fact, Illinois was one of the first states to get fully behind using fingerprints as a way to first identify criminals and then help to solve crimes. We did more research and learned that ballistics at the time was absolutely involved in both marks on bullets and being able to prove if a bullet came from a gun, but also very specifically about powder burns and how those were caused. And this actually became part of the Kruger trial. And then we also realized that it was a window into the criminal justice system of the time, because one of the startling things to us was in the articles about the trial, the name and hometown of every single juror was published in the paper. So not only did you know who was on the jury, but you knew where they lived, and that they were the ones going to be deciding George Kruger's fate, which indeed apparently got to at least one of the jurors, and it was good because they in fact had a reserve juror at the time, and one of the jurors had to bow out, whether it was from stress or from sickness, part of the way through the trial. So we were able to use this one instant, not just as a crime story or a true crime story, because we really wanted to be careful to make it more than that, but to use it to talk about the different way women were viewed at the time, and the fact that George and Bertha fought, and at one point earlier it comes out in the trial that Bertha thought of leaving him, but couldn't drive the wagon to drive herself away. The way that the criminal justice system worked, and then the different advances in science and how it was used at the time, and then how developments have happened since then. And it not only were the jury facts interesting, but also sharing with the Girl Scouts that we work with that in fact the jury of the Kruger trial would have been all male, because juries were picked from the voter rolls and women didn't have the vote at the time. And the same state's attorney who was the one prosecuting George was also state's attorney later on when women were about to get the vote in Illinois, and won our heart forever, because when he was asked whether or not he thought women getting the vote was a good idea, said yes, and then was subsequently asked whether or not he thought women on juries would be a good thing, and said yes. And in fact, he was fairly certain that if women had been serving on some of the earlier juries he'd tried cases in front of, that the results would have been different. So it gave us more of a window to the time. It allowed us to talk about issues that are still relevant today, and the interplay between science and history, and how the more you learn about things have changed and how things interact, it paints a portrait not only of the time, but of how things have developed, and gives people a way to talk about and learn things that was both fun and very different. We're happy to take questions if anybody has them, and thank you very much.
All right, so we have a few questions in the chat, and again, feel free to keep putting them in. A few are these ones that are just coming in now are more just based on some basic facts. So what current town would the Kruger farm be located in?
The Kruger farm would technically be in Long Grove.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then is Kruger Road named after them?
Yes, it is.
And then what cemetery are Bertha and Margaret buried in?
Ooh, I don't actually know. Our friends at Ela Historical Society know that, but have not shared it with us yet. So I would check with them if you are interested in where to find that.
There might be someone even on here that someone could put in the chat that possibly knows that too. And we're just getting some more comments about how interesting this was. It was so great and fascinating. What was like the most surprising thing when you guys were reading all these newspaper articles that came to you? Because that to me really tells me the most about the time period and about what's going on. So I don't know if you ever had like an aha moment when you were reading those newspaper articles, because you had a lot of examples of those in there.
I think
I think it. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that for me, as I was reading through the newspapers and the dates, I found newspapers about this story all over Illinois. So it was not even situated just in Lake County. It had become a huge topic. And something that made it difficult to follow was in the story was that some articles would go and interview individuals like the neighbor, LaFrance, and say, oh, what happened? What did you hear? And LaFrance would say, oh, when George was here, I heard some shots after he came to the farm. And then we went back. And then 2 days later, a different interview, he would say, oh, I didn't actually hear the shots. George just said that there were shots. And so I assumed that I heard the shots. So you really had to pay attention to all the details in the reporting and to follow the story. It even changed then for the testimony in the trial, because they listed a lot of the testimony and what people said. So like the sheriff, and you had to make sure to get your facts straight. We also found something that was very interesting was when they exhumed the bodies, they did it right at the cemetery. So they took and all the townspeople came around and everyone was just standing around while the coroner was examining the bodies in the cemetery to determine how they had actually died.
Wow.
So there were a lot of very interesting pieces that came along as we were researching.
That was maybe the most startling to us, was how very, very public everything was.
Yeah.
From the listing of the jurors to the fact that you were doing an autopsy of this woman, with the public watching, with the press watching, laid out on a headstone in just boom there. And it was very much the talk of the town. And in one case, we were startled by how public we were maybe also startled by how unintentionally modern and true crime it feels, because you've got reporters angling to get a story from George, who refused to talk to anybody. You have different neighbors being interviewed. You have the family maintaining innocence, and you have high-priced lawyers coming up from Chicago. All of the elements that you would see in a lot of different things today. And I will say we were both very surprised, because it was continuing research that Marina did to find out at the end that George actually ends up with the profit from the sale of the estate, which is just mind-boggling to us that was both possible and legal. So it continues to surprise us.
Yeah. Newspapers from a long time ago are so interesting to read. Like you said, how public all the information is. And I read another true crime story where they published the whole speech of someone pleading his innocence on a different murder case. And this was from, again, the 1800s. And they published his whole speech. And everything was just so out there back then. So that does lead, I was going to ask some questions about your research too, and there's another question that came on this. Was it difficult to find access to the articles in newspapers? And where did you go to find these newspapers? I might know the answer, but I'll let you guys answer that. Where did you find your research?
So I found a lot of newspapers. I used the library's databases for newspapers.com and ProQuest. They have a large portion of those newspapers, and it gets really difficult searching though in old newspapers because spelling. So Kruger's name could be spelled differently at different times, and so it really took a lot of using just keywords: Kruger murder trial. Knowing the dates from George Widener, going all the way back to George Widener, knowing the dates when things were happening was helpful to finding some of those articles. Yeah.
Yeah, and your local news, or Jenny's putting in the chat to your local library will probably have access to newspaper.com. That's a great research place, and I've seen a lot of that. And someone asked, did you use any legal records at courthouses or any legal research there?
We did not. We could certainly research more. The papers of the time did present a lot of the actual testimony at the trial, including the closing speech of both the prosecution and the defense attorneys. So you got a fairly full flavor of what was going on, and in fact, as a sidelight, a certain amount of competitiveness between local papers too, because some of the introductory paragraphs to stories in competing papers talked about how their account was the better account and the more accurate account, and the one that people should be trusting in order to follow this continuing story.
Yeah, the competitive. We have the best. There is some other comments coming in just to let people know that it's Fairfield Cemetery in Lake County. That's where Bertha is buried. So Diana put a link in the chat to findagrave.com, which is another really great resource that links to a lot of genealogy and family information. So if you ever want to use findagrave.com is really great, and your library might have access to that again too. And then is Widener Road, is that named after the same family in the story as well?
Yep. A lot of the Widener family was one of the prominent families in Buffalo Grove. If you are driving around Buffalo Grove, you might also recognize Raupp, which is another prominent family. A lot of the local roads are named after those families or the individuals in those families, such as Bernard is named after a Raupp. So, yep, that is the same family.
And then, Sorry, go for
Okay.
it, Debbie.
I will say one of the other surprising things when we made the exhibit and mentioned the neighboring farm and the hired help who had been part of it and who had featured in the trial. Excuse me. One of the visitors to the museum stopped in their tracks and she said, "Wait a minute, that's my grandpa." And so it had been, he had been, as a much younger man, one of the key witnesses in this story. And this is the first time she had ever found out about it, which
Wow.
was a great connection too, and made her go home and want to learn more.
Yeah, that's really fun when you hear those visitor connections too and surprising family histories. Like, wait, this happened in my family too. What? Um, and then just one last question for you all that just came in is how did you first learn of this story and do you think this could ever be a movie?
So the journal that we talked about from George Widener, that was actually loaned to the museum to be transcribed several years ago. So we do not have the original anymore, but we have the transcription. And so we typically use it for looking up around important dates or learning about other individuals in the town. And that's where we came across that tidbit about from George Widener about that George Kruger had been shot and that it had been assumed his wife and mother-in-law had both died, and then later he was taken to trial. So that transcription that they did at the museum, staff before me, many years ago, was our first hint
Yeah.
at this story.
It was the jumping off point, just reading through it to look for interesting things and just a double take between one page and the next where you go, "Oh, wait a minute. There has to be a whole lot more here." And we need to start finding out what at first, yeah, the immediate reaction was why didn't the diary put down more? But but then we are totally able to do that kind of research, and it grew into a far larger story than we ever anticipated.
Yeah, and just like Jenny, you guys were detectives asking those
Mhm.
who, what, where, when, why, and um, some really fascinating stuff there. Okay, sorry, it's just one other question came in, and do you want to continue doing local crime research now based on this? Do you have other things that you want to research?
Oh,
I will say that it certainly made us think about it, but I will tell you, and just like Marina said in the beginning, the Buffalo Grove was a very small community for a very long time, and that was without a doubt the flashiest thing that happened. We talk about this one because of all the different elements and because of the way it finishes, but for the most part, this was not a usual happening.
mm-mm.
Maybe the next interesting crime thing we have would be artifacts that were looted from St. Mary's Church, which were found in a pond 20 years later. So,
Yeah,
it's a whole different kind of
Mhm.
vibe.
Mhm. Yeah.
agreed.
Not to toot our own horn at the Dunn Museum, but we do have a presentation on true crimes in Lake County that talks about historic crimes. So, for example, the very first murder case that happened before this in Lake County, also in Ela Township. So, something's going on there. Um, and then covers a couple other interesting true crimes, especially around the Prohibition era. So if you want to look out for that, sometimes we offer that at the Dunn Museum and we can do it at various historical presentations as well. So I am going to now bring everybody on if Dr. Mooney-Melvin can join us and Jenny can join us again. We're going to wrap up our presentation. And again, I want to invite it to everyone. Excuse me. To ask any other questions to our presenters for this evening. If you want to think about anything that was shared with Dr. Mooney-Melvin from the importance of local history, any other questions that you're thinking about as we wrap up tonight. But I do want to pose to our presenters tonight, what does local history mean to you all? You know, Dr. Mooney-Melvin shared to her how important it is to her and to the research field, but what does it mean to you? Why is it important?
I'll go.
Go ahead, Debbie.
I'll go first because we think about this. We do a lot of school field trips at the museum and covering different topics and events, but also in one case, a very much a then and now program talking about older buildings and then what is there now. And it helps just what Dr. Mooney-Melvin said in the beginning, but you can see it with first, second, third graders. It helps people realize that they are part of a community, that it has changed and part of a continuum of a community, that this was what it used to be. This is what it is now. This is what I pass every day. I am part of this. And this story is not just a textbook story. This is my story too. It allows you to locate yourself in the community and locate yourself as part of the community, both for older residents who want to remember it as it was, but also for newer residents who get a light bulb when they see, you know, either the transition or the very few historic buildings we have left that they can recognize and be part of.
And I'll just add to that, too, another piece that at the Raupp Museum that we try to focus on is that history doesn't stop and local history doesn't stop. And so we want to keep collecting those stories from all of the new residents that are coming to Buffalo Grove and hear their stories as well. I think that's important, that it's not only about 100 years ago, but that history keeps happening. And we want to be able to collect that history in our towns and share those stories as well.
Mm-hmm.
I could jump off of Marina. I misunderstood, I think, one of the questions that was asked to me about how we're talking. I thought it was about how are we saving the information I just gave you. But I think the question was really like, how are you capturing today's history? And, you know, apart from clippings, we have clippings files, and it's old fashioned, but we have a clippings file here at the library. So anytime a new business opens, a business closes, anything like that goes in the clippings file. But I think it's important to remind people that a lot of our organizations are, or all of them, are fully dependent on donations from the public. So what we have in our collections is reflects what people have given us. So if you are thinking about, most people today, I think it's people today don't necessarily think the last 50 years was history because they lived it, but it was. Yesterday is history. So, you know, if you have family things, you owned a business in your town, think of your local historical society. Think of your local historical society, you know, and contact them about that. We actually, my mother-in-law was moving out of her house in Virginia, and she had the back bar from my husband's grandfather's drugstore in Fort Kent, Maine. We sent it home. I mean, that's a big example. It could be a matchbook from a local business, but anyway, think of us, contact us. We don't take everything, but contact us.
Well, I'd like to add to that, to what all of you have said, and that, you know, historians who see themselves as professional historians have often discounted, particularly when I was going through school, discounted local history because they saw it as a bunch of information without analysis. And I think one of the things that has really changed is, number one, an appreciation of some of that information, because that information which was recorded is now information that we use to think about things in new ways, but also a recognition on many of their parts that, in fact, when they talk about the history of a city, or they talk about what happens in World War I, or they talk about, water, and how the change in the Chicago River, it all comes down to understanding locality and place. And I think that has opened up lots of opportunities for people to see history in a very different way. And so the work that local organizations do is really important in helping to shape those stories and make them public to a wider audience.
Yeah, and I just want to add a few comments that people are making in the chat that go along with what you're saying, and thinking about the whole presentation. And I talked about, you guys are all detectives. You're all doing this scientific work too. And history is a science, and it requires research, and it requires you to go back and ask questions, but then constantly verifying, constantly proving those clues that you're finding, those mysteries that you're finding, those pieces of evidence, and putting it all together to tell that story. And that's also why it's so important to continue this research and make sure that we understand the past, so we can not only just understand the past, but that this research and the process to get there is so important too. So I think you all did a wonderful job presenting that tonight, and not only why it matters, but how you got to know this, and proving and verifying your facts. And in this day and age, it's so important. So I'm going to ask two more questions. I think I have time for two more questions, and there's lots more coming in the chat too. So we started this presentation tonight too, and Dr. Mooney-Melvin mentioned this, that we're now entering 2026 and recognizing the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. What should we be doing this year to commemorate that event in the local history field? Being in Lake County, we know the revolution did not happen here. But what do you think we should do to commemorate this event as local historians? Are you planning on doing? I know some people are already planning stuff.
I think for me, one of the themes that comes out of the Illinois organization that's helping with the 250 is doing history. And I think what we've talked about tonight, it shows that history is active. We've said that already. And the historical societies in your local areas are doing history all the time. And I think it's important to remember, while we're looking at national events, that there are other things going on consistently in your community.
I'll build on that too. I think something I've been thinking about and talking with other museums around the country is that 250 years ago, each state was not necessarily a state, or in a very different place. And so this 250th anniversary really gives local history here in Illinois a chance to look at our own local history here in Illinois, how our towns changed, but also, like you said, Jenny, how history keeps happening. And we want to be able to preserve those memories for the future.
Well, and, and if we think of the 250th as a way to think about what it was then that people saw as important, what changes did they want in their society, how did they want to gather information to help make those changes, we can all do that on a local level, on a state level, on a county level, to think about what do we want in the next 250 years, even if it's not tied to the revolution per se, it's still the process of thinking about the change in our communities and the direction we want to go.
Yeah, great thoughts. So we have two great questions. I know I said I had one more, but I want to be sure to get our audience questions too. So looking to the future, do you think the increasing digitization of our daily lives will make local history and historians' jobs easier or harder? So we know a lot of times you look at physical records, but now everything's digital. We don't have ways that we're saving emails. You had that diary example. People don't always have that physical diary anymore. So what do you think about that?
Harder. I mean,
Hard.
just one example is the digital native photograph, right? So we have hard copy photographs in our collection, and we're starting to get people donating us digital copies of hard copies, but everybody's photos are on their phone. So if you're out there taking a photo of your community today, it's only available digital. And for most of the historical societies in Lake County, we're all volunteer and don't have huge budgets. So trying to figure out how to receive those, house those, store those for long-term preservation is a real challenge.
Too, but because you just delete stuff so fast too without thinking about the future. You know, like, oh, I might save something if it was written down, but everything's again so digital, so I just delete, 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 delete constantly. Don't think about saving it as much.
We
That
will
future
say
people don't
that
want.
digital access to newspapers is a treat, though, as far as being
Yeah.
able to research that way. Not that I didn't make my bones running microfilm through machines, but so yes, saving of the digital images, oof, but having some digital access available. And, while we're doing local history research, Jenny talked about a man who was doing it, but from far away in different ways. So it allows out of state or even out of country people to have much greater access so that the potential for at least beginning to find interesting things or making connections that certainly were possible before, but a lot more difficult is interesting.
Yeah. That open access is giving more more stories told and finding the new stories there.
Sarah,
All
can I
right.
throw
So
in one thing?
sorry, Jenny. Go ahead.
There was just one person who tried to guess the 4 presidents, and they got 3 out of 4. The first president is Millard Fillmore, and then it was Abraham Lincoln, Grant, and Garfield.
Yes, I'm trying to keep up with the stuff in the chat, but I really enjoy that everyone's putting things in the chat. So keep doing that too. There's some great work there. People are talking about doing oral histories, connecting with your family, and lots of really great things in the chat. And one other thing that we're talking about with sharing these stories, someone has asked, is with all this great local research being done, is there a single website or a single book this is all being collected and documented in? I know in the past, if you are this to answer part of this person's questions, and then Jenny mentioned these, there are 2 Lake County history books that were written, centuries ago, one in the 1800s and one in the early 1900s that cover early Lake County history, but I don't know of any more recent Lake County history book other than Diana Dretsky's History of Lake County. So yeah, I don't know. Do you have any other answers to that? Places where we can find all this information.
Not
It's a good central place.
Yeah, no central point. I will say that as far as going forward, one of the efforts that the Lake County Historical Alliance is planning to make in the upcoming 2026 is to gather oral histories from mid-century on, the part where people don't think they're history yet, but they really, really are, and we want to get the stories now, and save them in a central website in a central location. So that is a beginning to think about that in that way. Sometimes the museums have digital exhibits that they put up so that even if you aren't able to go in a place, but yeah, there's not a centrally located one to talk about all of this in one place.
And I put a link in the chat to Diana Dretsky, who's the curator at the Dunn Museum. She has a Lake County history blog, so it covers a whole bunch of topics. in there that you might find interesting.
Yes. And a bit ago, there was a book, 200 Objects that tell the story of Lake and McHenry County history. So that is it's out of print now, but if you can locate it at your local museums, that did aggregate a lot of interesting stories from all around that we're talking about, not only the object itself, but each small museum chose 3 or 4 things that they thought really crystallized their local history. So,
yeah, that's a really good book to bring up too. Thank you, Debbie. All right. Well, we have come to the end of our presentation. So our theme tonight was historical surprises. I hope you all came away with one surprising, interesting fact and found out more about historical research. Thank you everyone for these fabulous presentations and for sharing your work and how you're continuing to document and share local history. I had a wonderful time with you all tonight. And as a reminder, this is just part 1. You can join us next Thursday for part 2 of the Lake County History Symposium, where we'll have 3 new presentations that'll be entirely different and fabulous. So join us then. You can sign up on the blog, sorry, not our blog, on our website at the Lake County Forest Preserve. I put the link in the chat, and Nicole's put it in the link for the chat. It was also in your email with the Zoom link. But you can reach out if you need to access the program next week as well. But thank you again, everyone, and take care. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you guys next week.
thanks, everybody.
Bye.